All right, I'm excited for this. Let's get started. Everyone ready?
Yes.
Welcome to OWASP at Netflix, May 2019. Thank you all for coming. We've got a lot of talks that I'm excited about tonight. This is going to be a really good one, and hopefully you've already gotten it, but if not, you'll load up on sushi here, whatever you'd like. Look right. So I just want to kick it off and say that OWASP runs basically because of all of you. You know, the community that we have here is amazing. I've been to other OWASP areas where they're not as fortunate, and there's not this many people that show up on a random Wednesday night. So this is really cool, and it always excites me to see so many people that are interested in security and passionate and willing to come out. So thank you. Now, we can use a few things. I want to see all of you up on this stage at some point, or a similar stage from another host. If you have a talk that you're interested in giving, please reach out to one of either myself or the other leaders. By the way, OWASP leaders, please stand up for a sec. There they are. Thank you so much. So if you have something that you would like to talk about, please reach out to us. We'd love to have you speak. You know, something you're practicing for some other conference, some work that you've been doing that you think is exciting, you want to share an idea, this stuff's all fair game and we'd love to have you. Now, if you want to have your company host and be the next Netflix in our line of hosts, we are actually booked out until September, but after that, we'd love to have you. So please, again, get in touch with one of our chapter leaders that stood up a minute ago. And finally, we could use sponsorships. The Bay Area chapter is very fortunate. The Bay Area chapter is very fortunate in terms of resources, but what we tend to do is use those resources to support places that don't have it so good. So, for example, we supported Seasides, which is something Prashant was involved in earlier, I think a couple of months ago. And what that's about is bringing security to India. It was a great event. People had a really good time, but the Bay Area was able to support that work, and I think that that's important. So if you are feeling generous and you want to help, people get into security that don't have it as lucky as us, then please consider donating to the OWASP Bay Area chapter or OWASP Global. Either one's fine. And with that, I want to hand it over to Brian Payne to introduce Netflix. Thank you.
Thank you, Travis. So, is anyone here familiar with Netflix? We're like this little company. We do videos a little bit. Yeah. So I just want to say thanks for coming out. It's always a pleasure to have people come to Netflix campus, and I love our campus and I love showing it off, basically. So it's fun to have you all here. Also, I think it's a nice opportunity just to let you know that Netflix has a really nice security team, and we happen to be hiring. And so if anyone here is interested in those kinds of things, certainly seek out anyone that you find with a Netflix jacket or t-shirt or something tonight, and we can talk about it. But we're hiring managers, we're hiring developers, we're hiring all kinds of things for our security team. So I won't go on and on because I know everyone's hiring, but just know that we are too. And otherwise, thanks for coming, and I will pass it off to Astha, who can get our panel started.
Thank you, Brian. All right, hi everyone. So without further ado, I would like to welcome our panelists for today's panel on getting started in security. So Nicole, Wendy, Charles, and Chris, can I please have you guys up on the stage? Now I feel like a fancy director. Forgive me for having my phone out. That's just where my notes are. Okay, so before we get started, I would obviously want to make sure that our panelists have the time to introduce themselves. So the topic for today's panel is getting started in security. I am your moderator. My name is Astha Singhal. I lead application security at Netflix and also help out with things here and there for OWASP. I really have the fortune of working with all these awesome people that do all these great things in security at Netflix. And they all have really, really interesting stories to share about kind of their journey of how they got started in security and are doing great work here at Netflix today. So maybe we'll start with Chris. So basically what I'm looking for is tell us about your background, how you got here, and maybe something that Travis called an on-brand story about yourself, which means that if somebody who knows you heard that story would be like, yeah, that's so you.
I started my career in the Marine Corps. I was attached to a national security agency doing intelligence. Went to Cyber Command doing threat intelligence, kind of when it first kind of began. Started my own company for a while. I did the consulting route for several years. And then I came here and I lead the threat intelligence program here at Netflix. One on-brand story is I'm a voracious reader, and I took money that was meant to buy school clothes, and I bought an A+ book because I had no idea what this computer stuff was about. I just had to get into it. So after my mom was pissed off at me for doing that, I think she kind of forgave me eventually when I came out here.
Hi, my name is Wendy Zenone, and I got into security by begging, pleading, trying to sell my children. I started my tech career at Facebook. I was in their marketing and ads department. If you've read that book, Chaos Monkey, that is about the team I worked on, which was really interesting. I started wandering over to the security team and just having conversations, booking meetings with random people, asking, how do I get in? I eventually migrated my way to White Hat Security, and I had some great mentors over there. One of the founders of the company was kind of my champion to get into security. I quit my job. I went to Hackbright Academy and learned how to build software, and then got my first job in application security, and it's just been a massive learning experience since then. At Netflix, I manage the vendor security program, and that keeps me busy every single day. And my on-brand, I've been thinking about this. I don't even know how to answer that. I've always been able to talk to anyone, and I think that's a huge asset when you're in the tech industry, because not everyone is that excited about talking to people, and I am. I mean, Chris and I could probably talk for 12 hours. So that, I think, is my superpower.
Yes. Wendy, you betrayed me. We were just whispering before we're like, I don't know what my on-brand story is. I don't think I'll share one. It was like, yeah, I won't either. Now I'm on the spot. I don't have an on-brand story. Maybe that's my on-brand story.
Right now.
Anyway, I'm Nicole Grinstead, and I am on the identity and access management team here at Netflix. So we manage our single sign-on platform, and then a few kind of interesting things that I work on in the security space with that, obviously, besides just securing all of our internal apps, no big deal, is adaptive authentication, being smart about when we prompt for second factors of authentication, and Stethoscope, which is our open source device health kind of endpoint solution. And let's see. I guess before, my background is just more in traditional software development, and I kind of fell into the security space working on the identity team at Yahoo prior to coming over here, and I think that's all.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Charles Nwatu. My background into security started out at Penn State University. I was an information assurance scholar, and I worked with the DoD coming out of school for about 9 years. Did a lot of traveling, saw a lot of interesting stuff, enjoyed it a lot, then decided to do something different, and came out to the West Coast and started doing a lot of incident response. This is my background in malware reverse engineering. Currently, I'm here at Netflix, obviously. I run the corporate security program and looking how to secure our individuals across the multiple accounts that they have within Netflix. An on-brand story, well, I mean, I would say like I really love talking to people, just like as Wendy mentioned. I think we all could probably talk for hours. And something about me is that I like to say, like, meet people with grace. When it comes to the security journey, I think at times as security practitioners, we can be a little harsh to our end user population. And if you meet people with grace, sort of bring them along the journey, I think you can have better outcomes. I believe that security is a behavior modification. And as part of that, we have to do our job to sort of help guide and bring people along on that journey. Yeah, that's it.
All right, well, thank you very much. So what I'm hoping for today is, like I have come up with some questions that I have wanted to ask these folks. So I will get us started with that, and then hopefully we'll have enough time for you guys to ask any questions that you may have. All right, so I know, Wendy's story to me was very much kind of like, the passion of working in security. So what is the thing that made you so interested in the field?
I read a book about social engineering, and the part that really interested me was where it was described on how you manipulate people to choose your restaurant.
What was the name of the book?
I will get back to you on that. It's his book, but I don't know if that was it.
Demasking the social engineer.
I have my Kindle here, I will look. But he made an example of how we social engineer all the time, and maybe you don't even know it. When you really want pizza and you kind of drop some hints, and then eventually the person's like, we should get pizza. And you're like, that's a great idea. So I was like, I could do this. I didn't have any technical understanding of security at the time, and so I figured that was my way in. And then it just built from there. I come from, we have multiple security people in my family, and I had been to DEF CON and Black Hat a few times, not as a security professional, but more of a lurker, I guess. And so I really was having some FOMO and wanted to get in there. And someone said, what do you want to do? And I said, security. And they're like, well, what? I'm like, I don't know, security. So it's been a journey for me to figure out what I'm interested in and where I'm going with that. But I'm learning every day, and I just love it.
Nicole, I know you said that you kind of fell into it, but would you care to share with us?
Yeah, so when I first started my career, I lived in Missouri, and I really wanted to move to the West Coast and work for a big tech company. So I got an interview and a job offer at Yahoo, and the team that I kind of got matched up with was the identity and access management team there. So there, it's definitely a security product, but it was not considered part of the security team necessarily. But when you are working on a product that is actively so this was, I guess I started in 2014, and was there for 3.5, 4 years. So if any of you guys remember the big data breach, if you're working on a product that's being actively attacked by nation state actors, you kind of become a security engineer pretty quickly. And yeah, I really liked the excitement and thinking about, it's excitement and stress at the same time. But it's much nicer when you're on the other side of being ahead of the attacker. But yeah, it was just a really interesting experience and something that was kind of a formative part of my career that I realized I really enjoyed thinking about still being a software engineer, but being able to apply that to kind of a niche space and a little bit different mindset.
Trial by fire, I like it.
Yeah.
Maybe next question for Charles. Charles, what do you think is like the biggest sort of barrier to entry in the security world?
So I would say from my experience as a hiring manager for the past couple of years, I think it's the balance as to how do we allow, I don't say if allow is the proper word, but how do we make the market more viable for junior and entry-level individuals who have potentially the desire and the training and education within security to actually get into security. And with the market, I guess, extremely hot for senior level, mid-level, and above, it makes it very, very challenging where, essentially companies are consuming each other's security professionals, but there's also a base of untapped potential, untapped perspectives, untapped experiences that may not be allowed the opportunity to express themselves at that table due to the fact that the barrier of entry to just getting the job is what's holding them back. So it's how do you find that balance as an organization, a security org, where you have the capacity to bring on new talent, to foster and support their growth, but at the same time, sort of still meet the objectives that you're hitting, that you have to develop and need for the organization at large.
Chris, do you have anything else in that?
Yeah, so to kind of piggyback off of what Charles was saying, he's exactly right. But also, I think from the individual's perspective, that I think belief is a huge issue. Just by nature of sort of how the cybersecurity realm sort of was built up, it was almost like this magical thing that no one could ever do, and oh, you're not smart enough to do it, and it's not something that's like left to the geniuses of the world to do. I think people would surprise themselves if they, just took a single class, like, oh, I could do this, and everybody has the capacity to learn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that was definitely sort of like my first experience. I remember being in school and learning all this stuff about like, oh, Alice wants to talk to Bob. How do they do this securely? And like learning in detail how TLS works and all of this stuff. And I was like, okay, someone hire me for an internship because this stuff seems really interesting. And then it's like the things where it was sort of like a loop of people kept asking me questions of like, oh, do you know these tools? I was like, no, if you give me my first job, then I will know these things. And then I can go get the second thing after that. But yeah, that's definitely kind of challenging of like betting on new people and giving them the opportunity to get started. Okay, so obviously you guys all sort of started in security from very, very different backgrounds. So Chris, what do you think was sort of the biggest, like maybe non-technical skill set that you have that makes you successful at your job even today?
Yeah, I'd say the biggest talent that I have or skill that I have is my ability to communicate. Being a threat intelligence practitioner, being able to write and communicate things that are applicable to an organization is kind of the bread and butter of what I do. You could do all the analysis in the world. You could find little nuggets and breadcrumbs that no one else has been able to find, but if you can't communicate it well, then you're kind of doing a fool's errand. So yeah, I'd say communication is key.
Have you done sort of specific like training in technical writing or anything like that to build that, or?
So I do a small little podcast called secdevops.ai, and one of the tips that I actually gave on air once is if you guys tell anybody, I'll kill you. No, I'm joking. But one of the tips that I do is if you take something like a big breach that happened, whether or a big event like NotPetya or something like that, if you take it and you write an article that's like, say, 500 words, then you rewrite it in 250 words. And then you write it again in 100 words so that there's like literally like zero fat. And every single word is valuable. I think that really helps you practice your ability to convey information in a seamless manner.
Wendy? Yes.
I was in your story. My brain was in your story. I was like, okay, get it down to 100 words, okay? I think I'll piggyback onto the communication, but something that I learned to do from the very beginning was to ask questions. I think that is something that I've talked to many people that say they're afraid to ask, what does that mean? And I have an amazing boss because I was in a meeting with him the other day and I heard something and I was just like, okay. And then he's like, what do you mean by that? I'm like, I love him. This is the best. Because I think a lot of times people say things, they use acronyms, they use big words, they use, special phrases that mean something. But then if you're going to actually get something out of that meeting and you're going to walk away with an action item, you need to fully understand what's being asked of you. And if you do not understand what that person's saying, and it's hard if we're coming into security in a non-traditional way, you feel less confident to say, what do you mean by that? What does that mean by, XYZ. So it takes a lot of courage to be able to be in a meeting with a bunch of senior engineers and say, can you explain what that is? And I think learning that from the very beginning has helped me grow and helped my knowledge base grow, and also maybe has helped other people in the meeting to feel a little more comfortable to ask what that is. It's okay not to know.
One skill that served me well is just being able to see things from different perspectives, and maybe this will sound bad, but see the worst in people. And just think about different ways that things could be, specifically for security and software, things could be exploited, or just think about the different ways that people see things, and how not everybody always takes the same path.
For me, what I would like to probably say about is like two things. One, I believe there's no quote unquote traditional path to anything. So each person's own path is essentially their own experience. And those experiences provide those perspectives that which brought together in a room or a group of individuals that are trying to solve problems allows for, as Nicole was mentioning, just a different frame of perspective and thought. I think that's a unique aspect to have within any group or within any organization. So that's like one of the big things that I like to look for is challenging people to sort of speak up and provide that perspective, provide their experiences, because it is valuable. And on the other thing I would probably say more so is that words matter. Like there is a way to sort of explain things to individuals in a way that I call it consumable, where that we don't get the curse of knowledge of technical jargon that sort of anchors our conversations when we're within our security brethren, but also like when we go outside our security community, how are we engaging and communicating with individuals to make sure that we're doing that translation, as Chris mentioned. Could you filter your statements in a way that someone on the opposite side could actually walk away with an idea and understanding of what you just told them? I think that is a skill set that transcends any technical capability, because as Chris mentioned, you can find the greatest thing, you can write the greatest, you can do all the analysis, decompiling and everything else, but if you cannot articulate that thing to someone else, that is a failure.
And it's interesting, right? Like that skill set becomes more and more important as you grow in your career, because then you're talking to, say, other leaders that are not in security, and you have to explain things to them. And, like if you're a CISO, then you're explaining things to the board and things like that. So communicating with like someone who does not speak the same language as you per se is definitely very important. Is that what made you choose corporate security, Charles? Because you're doing security for not engineers? Always?
I would say my background lends itself to, that's like my comfort zone where I feel that I have the greatest impact. I do believe that part of the skill set is, like I said, when you meet people with grace, you are trying to walk in their shoes and trying to understand, how do I make sure that you walk away in this engagement, understanding the perspective that I'm trying to get you to. And I put that challenge on my team members, hey Wendy, to do the exact same experience, because it is important to sort of like do that translation and to make sure that they walk away with like, oh, I either learned something new or I broke down that barrier where they felt comfortable to ask a question that I didn't demean them or didn't put them down about that particular exchange. So I would say, yes, I really do enjoy the ability to filter on the fly and to make sure that when I meet a person, they're engaged in a way that they walk away at least learning something new.
Cool. Okay, so Chris, what do you think are a few things that you would recommend for somebody that wants to get started in security? Else now?
Yeah, so there's a few things that I like to tell people to do when you're trying to make any sort of pivot within your career, but especially to cybersecurity. One thing is find a project where you either solve a problem for yourself or solve a problem for people, that you can actually apply those skills and sort of get that experience. I found a lot of experience in building my own personal startup. I didn't understand threat intelligence to the degree I do now without that. So start a project. You'll even find that you can even get a job just based on those projects, because even though you don't necessarily get paid to do that, if you have the skills, we are in such a skill gap right now that you have an opportunity to actually get a job. The second thing would be to find a mentor in the space that you want to grow in. And I think you'd be surprised at how open people will be to helping you. I mean, feel hurt if they can't do it because they're busy, but just go to somebody else and try to get that. And then also, once you get those roles, this is the third thing, once you get that role, I'm sure everyone on this panel has felt it at some time, but that imposter syndrome starts to creep in, especially when you get into a role where you're brand new and you need to grow into it. So have confidence. You're obviously there for a reason. Your employer either sees some potential or a skill set that they need at that organization. So just basically be confident.
I would suggest networking. I was in security for only a few months, and I met someone who is back there. Brendan, I see you. And Brendan told me, like, within minutes, he's saying that, something about jobs and different positions. I was like, oh, I'm new. He's like, don't ever say that. Don't ever say that. You should always be confident. And I still think of that, and that has stayed with me. And I'm here, a couple jobs later, and I'm doing okay. And the networking has been huge. Most of my jobs in security have been because of networking. I met Travis through networking. I met Brendan. I met so many people through it. And you'll come to realize that your network is so much stronger than LinkedIn and Indeed and whatnot when you're looking for jobs or looking for a mentor, advice, anything like that.
That's definitely true. So from the kind of standpoint of like networking and the community, so maybe I'll move on to Nicole. Nicole, what do you think we as a community can be doing better to try to, make it easier for newer people to, come be a part of this community?
I think one thing that has been emphasized a lot in this talk already is just that there are a lot of skills that are very beneficial to a security team that outside of just, being able to sit in a dark room with a hoodie on and like hack all night, which is kind of the stereotypical vision or whatever of this like maniacal genius. But, like many people have said already, that like communication and being able to talk to non-security people about why security is important and all of those types of skills bring a lot to the table as well. And I think that highlighting that those skill sets might attract more people.
Charles?
I probably would just reiterate what I said before in terms like, I'll probably say two things. So first is like take a chance, go out on the limb, because that's where the fruit is, as my wife would tell me. Because in order to sort of make that leap of faith, you sort of have to go out of your comfort zone. And it is okay to be uncomfortable. Part of that process is learning and stretching yourself in a place, in a matter that will challenge you. And I'm all for stretching people to sort of think and push beyond what they believe they're capable of. I think as a manager, something I really, really enjoy is seeing the growth of others where they may not see it themselves and highlighting the different paths or options for them that they could try to take to get there. In terms of how do we get more people inside the security family, I would say like one of the few things is we have to provide a way for entry level or individuals who are transitioning careers to actually participate. It's one thing to say, yeah, it's great to go do this pivot. It's great that you did this pivot, but right now I'm looking for someone that has 8 years of experience. So it's how do we balance, once again, that combination of, okay, like how do we evaluate and give you the opportunity to learn and build your experiences, while at the same time facilitating the growth of the overall security team.
Yeah, I think one of the things that like I really like about OWASP, and one of the things that Travis has been doing a great job at over the last year is actually concentrating a lot of these meetups and all of these things towards folks that are wanting to get into security, and providing a forum for them to find that network, and providing a forum for them to actually present their first talk ever, and all of those sort of things. And it's really about giving people the opportunity to get their foot in the door. And then given like the skill gap today, and given that there are so many different things to be done, and for us to accept that we don't do anything special, it's like a job, just like being an engineer is a job, and each of those things need different skill sets, and some of it is common between what you would do just as like say a software engineer or working like intelligence in the NSA and all of this different stuff, right? Okay, so we have some time left. I was hoping we could take some questions from our lovely audience. And I see the first question over there in the corner.
Hi, I'm Jeff Clavin. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. I teach graduate courses in cybersecurity, engineering, management, and communication between law, business, and engineering people. So, from your experience, what stands out in your education that you want to see more of in the classroom, or from your own self-directed learning? And how do you plan to continue to learn?
So I say for me personally, the experience that I have right now is that like being as a manager, I'm not gonna lie, I don't do a lot of the hands-on stuff that I like to do. So like my personal hobby right now is like I participate in random CTFs and I work on assembly code on like just for fun to just challenge me. In terms of like what I would like to see in like especially in the academia world, in terms of like what translates from academia into I don't want to say real world, but into like your work environment, I'd probably say more courses on just the fundamentals of how things work. I think one of the things to really understand as a security practitioner is that your ability to understand the nuances of how things work, I think it allows you to explain them in ways, whether you're using analogies, metaphors, so that other people can sort of grasp the concepts. And I think as professors and teachers, there's a great load on your shoulders to sort of help foster that type of thinking, to allow them to bridge those types of gaps and those knowledge areas in a way that it can be transferred to other people.
Great question. I would say, I mean, one thing that I do to keep learning is I listen to quite a few security podcasts and just try to keep a good pulse on what's going on in the community and in the news, and challenge myself with projects and stuff, same kind of thing that you were mentioning, Charles. I would say that, unfortunately, looking back on my formal education, there was, as a computer science student, there was really nothing in the curriculum about security, and it was just something I kind of learned after I got out. And even my first job, it wasn't something that was really emphasized on. So I think that's, even if you aren't going to focus on security, I think that at the education level, it's something that needs to be more built into the curriculum, just because, you know, any software engineer, it's really important.
I have a small thing to add to that. So I actually did go for formal education in security for my master's, and one of the classes that I kind of just took for fun was like this negotiation mini that they offered over at the business school. And I feel like in addition to like all of the stuff from my technical security degree, I actually apply a lot of the concepts from that class in my day-to-day work, which was a pleasant surprise for me. And it would have been nice to learn that just as a part of this program.
I think this question is for Charles, but how would you evangelize like the benefits of reverse engineering when you don't work for a company that's in the defense industry or a security firm?
So I would preface this like these are my own beliefs and my own opinions. I actually think that space is very commoditized at that level of analysis, unless you're like in a very particular vertical or industry. That skill set to me, it's like very particular. Like there are companies that will actively seek out that type of skill set for the vertical for which they're in. But I think as a whole, in terms of security, I think it's just a very commoditized space that you can pick up most off-the-shelf products to get you 80% there in terms of what that thing is, or outsource it to other companies that specialize in those types of like incident response, malware reverse engineering concepts that you can get, like once I said like 80%, 90% of what that thing is. So I personally, that's part of the reason why I sort of backed out of that space a little bit. I just didn't see the actual growth unless I was going to stay within the federal government or one of those big contracting companies.
Excuse me, I have just a follow-up to the education question, right? So I see a lot of students coming out of programs now that are about cybersecurity. And I think that what they get is a really nice traditional cybersecurity background. But I guess being that you all work at Netflix, right, who's using AWS and GCP and all these like new cloud technologies, I don't see those getting taught in these cybersecurity programs, where do you, I guess, like, where did you pick them up, and where do you expect, the next generation to be picking those things up?
Yeah, so with that, I completely agree with you. I think the benefit of having a traditional cybersecurity background or schooling is the ability to pivot from that traditional background into the more nuanced or niche things in security. Like for myself, like, so I'm traditional, Intel person, and then also a traditional SOC person. I came from security operations, been doing it for about 5 years, but then when I came to Netflix, a lot of those concepts and ideas and workflows went out the window, and I had to kind of start from scratch, from bare bones. Okay, what do I need to do in order to execute my mission? And so you have to sort of rely on the knowledge that you've learned from traditional education, but then also have that ability to apply new concepts and creative thinking to the new stuff.
I also appreciate the drinking from the fire hose situation. My first security job, they sent me to spin up a bug bounty program. I had no experience in bug bounty. I was new to application security. So it forced me to ask a lot of questions, lean on my team, lean on classes that I could find. To this day, that's still one of the best experiences that I've had, is not knowing and then being forced to figure it out. Because as Charles said, you need to be uncomfortable. If you're not uncomfortable, then you're not really progressing and you're not growing. And the work that I'm doing here at Netflix is new and different from my previous job. And it's just, it leaves that knot in your stomach, but asking those questions, meeting with different teams, being like, I'm not quite sure what the next step is. Being open to asking those questions, it improves your knowledge base, but then also helps form more communication with other teams so you can work cross-functionally. So I don't think not knowing AWS when you get out of school is a bad thing. I think having some sort of understanding of just general tech, and then going in. And another thing I'd add to the education side of it is I read this book called, well, actually I listened to it, Soft Skills for Software Engineers, and that was the best. That's like the missing link of what they teach you. They teach you all the tech side, but then there's these other things on how to interview, how to communicate, how to write your resume, how to be more soft in your skills and less technical, so it balances out. And I would highly recommend that book.
Actually, sorry, can I? I have a question for Nicole, because I know, Nicole, you came from doing engineering at a company that wasn't doing cloud infrastructure, and then you came to Netflix. And obviously, I assume some of that may have been learning it on the job versus, I don't know if you did prep before your interview. So I was curious on your perspective on this.
Yeah, good question. I hadn't really thought of it from that lens, but I just, I got here and I figured it out. And I kind of like to be in that uncomfortable spot, like a few other people have mentioned already, that you just drink from the fire hose and you learn, and a lot of those same fundamental concepts apply, but there's definitely nuances that you rely on your colleagues for, and you learn as you go.
I was going to say, in terms of I would say what I've noticed in the industry in terms of as a hiring manager in previous roles when it comes to like the AWS GCP conversation, I sort of look at it like, what are the principles that you can take away from those service platforms? So the concepts of identity access management, immutable code, if you can infrastructure as code, those core concepts are applicable whether you're using Azure, GCP, or AWS. Is just the nuances, as Nicole mentioned, is how you implement that. So that's one of the aspects I look as to when it comes to the education aspect. If you know the fundamentals, how you apply them are just the nuances and variances of those particular platforms or that particular technology.
Right. Well, thank you everyone for your questions, and thank you to all my wonderful panelists for sharing all of their great stories and knowledge. This was super fun for me. I hope everyone else enjoyed it as well. And thank you, Travis, for making us do this. I guess I will hand it back to Travis to welcome our next speaker. Thank you for being a great audience.
So, master tip right there. Oh. Really fast. Quickly reminder. The panel was pretty sweet, huh? I like that a lot. Next up, we have Ryan talking about some really cool forecasting stuff, and he's going to talk slow.
Is that a forecast? What's your probability on that?
30% chance of slow. Oh, come on. There we go. Gotcha. Look at that, you're already getting claps just because the tech works.
All right. Hey, everyone. This is an awesome venue. This is like a great place to speak. This is a beautiful room and everything. So yeah, my name's Ryan. Thanks for letting me speak to you today about some stuff that I've been working on. The title of my talk is Forecasting Browsers and in the Wild Exploitation. So what I do and what I work on right now is just measuring things that I care about. And that's what this talk is about. It's about measuring risk. So in particular today, I want everyone here to leave and know how to perform a quantitative measurement of this statement. How likely is it for Chrome to be exploited in the wild next month? So about this talk, first we're going to discuss measuring risk. Then I'll discuss the dangers of risk measurement. After that, I'll discuss how a few professionals got together and measured this specific risk. So this is supposed to be a very repeatable, not thought-leady, holistic presentation. I want you to be able to do the same thing that we did here in risk, in measuring risk. So we're going to start fairly abstract in discussing this problem of measuring risk. So we're all familiar with this. We're all familiar with how to calculate risk, but we're also very familiar with how ridiculous some of the measurement methods are in dealing with risk. We've all seen, we've seen others measure probability with crayons. We use the word probably to describe a probability, like this vulnerability will probably be exploited. That's not measurement. We want more than that. We want to do better than that. So let's confront this problem. Let's measure the probability that something unwanted could happen, and let's do it quantitatively, like actual engineers. So let's first confront this by looking at how we measure easily quantifiable stuff. Like, for instance, measuring distance. You would get a ruler. You'd get a ruler, and you'd hold it up to something, and you would say, this thing is this many inches. And you would do that because you trust the ruler. You picked the ruler, and you think that rulers are useful. So let's say, however, that you don't have a ruler, right? You're not helpless. We've all done this thing, right? Or you've moved furniture, like you've used your arms to mark something and then move it around a really tight corner. Or you use your feet and you measure feet because your foot is about a foot. So we trust ourselves with approximations. We trust ourselves with this feature of our minds that we can approximate things to some degree. And we think that's useful in some situations. So this is really important for us. So the output of a ruler is inches. But the output that we need to answer our Chrome question is a probability. But the problem is I can't take a device like a ruler and just hold it up to the future and say, what is the probability that Chrome will be exploited in the wild next month? That's a problem, right? So we have to figure that out. Now, to help us get there, here's what's called an odds table. And this is published by the intelligence community. And they use this to stabilize what's called the words of estimative probability that is used in analyzing intelligence. And this subject matter is, it's very different from qualitative subjectives like, how much do I love something? Or how beautiful is this room that we're in, right? It's very different because this is very measurable, like speed or weight or other things. It's subjective, but it's quantifiable. And that is very useful for us in measuring risk. So how do we measure probability? This means that we can measure probability as experts by forecasting the probability that a risk scenario will or won't occur. Thus, the expert is used as a direct measurement tool, or I'm sorry, in lieu of a direct measurement tool to measure a future probability. And we do that with a forecast. So the problem with this is that I've led you astray. If I were to end this presentation right now, I would have harmed all of you. So prediction is treacherous. It's this sometimes measurably useless thing. And it's a very, very difficult thing for humans. And this is a shorter version of a potential talk, but this is something that deserves its own talk. Entire academic careers are spent on this subject. It's roughly known as decision science. It's a Nobel Prize winning area. It has decades of research, and it's very, very thorough. To summarize a lot of work, the thing that we need to know is that experts are really bad at making predictions, if not harnessed correctly. Now, this subject matter is very important. So what I want you to think for a second, I want you to think about why you're here. I imagine you want to be better at security. I imagine you want to be better at something in your career or your hobby or something. Maybe you want to be the best at that thing, that talent or that skill. And you might go as far as saying that I want to be world renowned at what I do. I want to be the best. I want everyone to know me for what I'm good at. You might have something like that in your mind, and that's great. But the problem is that your subject matter expertise, as you develop in a career, as you grow and you progress, it really doesn't have that much influence over your prediction skill. There's way too much research to show this, but as you develop in a subject matter, your ability to make predictions in that same subject matter, it does not grow as well. And this is the reason that this is the way it is that a lot of professional industries and careers do not actually value the things that develop prediction skill. And it's it'll be very obvious after we talk about it for a little bit. So we rarely perform any kind of accounting on the predictions that we make over time. We don't keep score. And specifically, we don't put a time frame on the predictions that we make. And as an example of this, take like a rainmaker, right? A rainmaker will take your money, right? They'll say, I'm going to make it rain, and I'll take your money, and I promise I'll make it rain. And when you ask why hasn't it rained yet? Just wait. It'll rain, right? Because it'll always rain. That's rainmaker fraud. They'll take your money and then it'll rain someday. And that sounds a lot like someone, right? It's only a matter of time before you get hacked, right? It's only a matter of time before you're breached. Everyone is always worried about this thing happening. And of course, that's something that we say is that it's only a matter of time before it happens to you. That's rainmaker fraud. That's not impressive. It's not impressive to me, and it's not something that I like about our industry. So I want better than that. We also use qualitative language in the predictions that we make. So like I said earlier, this vulnerability is unlikely to be exploited, right? Or it will probably be exploited. So when it is or it isn't exploited, you were right, right? Upon test, you were right. So we're always right. When are we wrong, right? When can we be tested with an empirical standard? It's very difficult, right? So I don't like that. Fortunately, there's hope. So there are methods that make forecasting more effective. There are techniques that make forecasting useful. And we can mitigate a lot of the problems that I've discussed this far in this presentation. So I've been very pessimistic, but now it's time to get optimistic. So many other industries have found themselves with the same accounting problem of risk and predictions. And we benefit from them with 70 years of research and documentation and professional standards to benefit from this. They all share concepts in this field, whether they call it this or not, but they all share concepts in probabilistic risk assessment, for better or worse. And I'm going to take those lessons and I'm going to attack our Chrome problem with it, and you're going to watch. So what I've done is I've taken as much as I can from previous research. I haven't invented or found anything on my own, and I've distilled it down to a risk-agnostic approach that's on GitHub. There's documentation to support it, and I'm going to go over 4 concepts that are important for us to attack this Chrome forecast, and that's the scenario, forecasting, calibrations, and a panel. Start with the scenario. So first, we need to pin down our risk. We need to create a Chrome scenario to measure. And this isn't hard. Probably done this before. It's just like a tabletop scenario. It's a fictional statement about the future within a time frame. Follow Bad Things Daily. That's my tabletop account. It's my hobby. So this is starting to lay our groundwork for measurement of Chrome. Now, I want to precisely define our problem in an unambiguous statement in a time frame. And in this case, we've chosen an observable event, and it has some qualitative language inside of it, but our scenario is that we have to actively discover this thing, a critical Chrome vulnerability that's being exploited in the wild in September of 2018, specific time frame. Now, Chrome, this scenario has qualitative language in it. We need to make that unambiguous and specific. Now, critical severity is qualitative language, but it's applied by the Chromium team and the Chromium bug tracker. And they have a definition for it, and we can trust them to apply this label. We can trust them to apply this severity to a bug. Critical severity issues allow an attacker to run arbitrary code on the underlying platform with the user's privileges. And we trust them to apply this to their bugs. The other bit of qualitative language here is in the wild. What the hell does in the wild even mean? You have a definition, I imagine. Some of you believe you have a definition. But if we were to take a break right now and let you speak to the people next to you about what does in the wild mean, you're all going to argue. You're all going to have fights, and we'll never come back to the presentation. So we needed to make legalese about what in the wild means. And this isn't meant to be an industry standard or a specific definition, but this is meant to lock down a forecast definition for us in measuring a risk. So we had to talk about issues around honeypotting, right? If an exploit hits a honeypot, is it in the wild or is that research? Does in the wild mean a certain volume of victims? Does that mean lots of victims? Or does that mean a victim? Do we actually have to see the victim get exploited for us to declare something in the wild? Or what if we just have the proof of concept, but we don't see it yet in the wild? Oh wait, you're right, it's not in the wild yet. Wait. So we had to lock this down, and that's what we did. So that's just part of forecasting and measurement, is making very specific circumstances that you can judge in the future, and it makes the scenario less ambiguous. Next, given a scenario, we need to structure the outcomes that we will be forecasting. And you're also familiar with this. You're going to find that you're familiar with every step of this. We check the weather. We're all wearing pants today because it's a little bit cold, right? We made a prediction about whether it's going to be raining today or not, and we're familiar with this. So it will rain tomorrow. Yes or no? That's one or the other. The options have to be mutually exclusive, and they have to represent all possibilities of the future. So raining has two options, yes or no, and we're going to keep things simple and just do that for our scenario. So will we discover a critical Chrome exploit in the wild in September of 2018? Our options are only yes or no, and we'd be forecasting one versus the other. This next concept is calibration. So just like you would calibrate the scope of a rifle to have good aim, you would calibrate experts that are working with probability. And simply put, this is a training problem. This is a very simple training problem. And to describe it briefly, we're going to talk about the superfans. So who do you think they would say will win on Sunday?
The Bears.
The Bears, right. So they also think the Bears are going to win the Preakness and the Indy 500, and they're never wrong. Because if they are wrong, they will have a hilarious reason for why they're not wrong, and that gives us Saturday Night Live. So they can't be helped. So they're off the hook. But we have a room full of non-fictional security professionals that might want to do this right. So let's say I were to repeatedly confront you with a track record of every prediction that you've ever made, throughout the day, every day of your life. You would start to behave differently. Instead of saying things like, the Bears are totally going to win on Sunday, you might say something like, I think the Bears have a 60% chance of winning on Sunday. Or you might say, I need to have a historical analysis of the Bears' performance under similar conditions. Or I'm a huge Bears fan, so I need somebody who's not a Bears fan to talk to me first before I actually forecast this because I'm biased, right? And this is calibration as you develop your prediction skill. And this is actually one of the most important things that you can have as a professional in measuring risk, is this concept of being calibrated and being trained to have less bias going into a forecast. Now, despite, even if I were to train you to be a calibrated forecaster in risk measurement, you would still have bias. Everyone has bias, and that's okay. But we can diminish that because we all have different biases. So if I were to get a group of people together and simply average together their beliefs, I can drown bias a bit, and that helps make a forecast a little bit more rigorous, and it helps defend against some of the bias that goes into prediction making. So what I did, and this is getting back to the Chrome forecast, is I got together 15 security professionals. They included engineers, managers and directors and CISOs and journalists. They were male and female. They were entry-level engineers to staff engineers. Some of them were calibration trained, some of them weren't. We tried to just achieve diversity with this panel and perspective and skill and everything. And that was what we used going into this measurement of Chrome. Now, so far, I've been describing the infrastructure of forecasting, the tools that you need, and what kind of goes into a forecast. But now I want to discuss the Chrome forecast specifically and how this panel approached that problem. So most of the analysis was done in the Chromium bug tracker, which is called Monorail. And at the time of the forecast, there were about 126 critical bugs that were ever found in the 100+ months of Chrome's existence. On average, they pay out about 10 bug bounties a month to people for varying severity bugs. And there's about 2 CVEs that are issued per month with a critical classification against Chrome, the Chromium code base as well. So serious bugs find their way to the Chrome team on a regular cadence. But that doesn't really mean that they're going to be exploited, right? Just by finding critical bugs, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're finding them in the wild. In fact, at the time, discussing this with the panel, we had a lot of trouble even thinking of a single case where a critically classified, it's a tongue twister, critically classified Chrome bug was ever exploited in the wild. And we thought to ourselves, okay, we'll research, we'll talk to others, we'll gather data on this, and we still couldn't find one. So it brought this question, are they so rare that they're not observable, or were there none at all? Which is a difficult problem to grasp or to deal with. So what we did was we called up Chris Evans, who founded the Chrome security team, and we asked him the same question with his sort of inside experience on this. And what he said was that there weren't any in the wild full Chrome critical exploit scene while he was at Google, and he was there for a long time. I doubt there have been any since, because the team is very transparent and it would be a big deal. And no one sane really doubts that the top-end governments have critical exploit capability against Chrome. So we found this to be very informative. It lended a strong opinion, similar to ours, about the lack of in-the-wild exploits historically, but it doesn't rule them out entirely. They could have still happened and just not been observed. But many of us felt that we were predicting something that's alike to a black swan. It's a falsifiable event, but it's very rare. It's indeed rare. So one of our last steps as a panel was to create an odds table that reflected what we needed to express here. And we pre-calculated what the probability of anything, happening per month would look like per year if translated from month odds to annual odds. And this is just an agnostic prediction rubric to help translate what you might state in a sentence into a numeric form. So for instance, if you very strongly believed that something occurs once every 28 years, you would have a monthly likelihood of about 1/3%. Or if you believe something happens every 6 months, that might mean a monthly likelihood of about 16% to 17%. So it's just to help guide what you would be issuing for a forecast. We gathered up all the data, everything that we talked about, and we shared it. So every panelist had access to the same data. And we have a tool that we've put together for collecting forecasts from experts. And this is to help shield them from bias and to help keep everything in one place and keep scoring the same. But this is something that is not needed. You can do all of this with a spreadsheet. You can do this with napkins. You can do this with a whiteboard. This is sort of an aside, but we have a tool that we use that there's a demo up at e6e.io. You can email me. I have an email at the end of this presentation if you want to look at source code or deploy it. You can contact me there, but this is easy enough to use without tooling. So drum roll, please. The panel finished, and they answered this question with a forecast. Their result landed in between 1% and 2%. So translating that with the odds table, that gives us a statement of expecting one in the wild exploit every 4 to 6 years in Chrome. Now, interestingly, one of the biggest debate points, this concluded in September, or this was for the month of September of 2018. And if you remember that time frame, one of the biggest debate points was the political climate and how it related to in the wild exploitation, which was interesting. So some panelists believed that at the time, so it was the Brexit was in the news, midterm elections came around, and there was military activity that picked up at the same time. And some panelists felt that those are things that would increase the likelihood of observing an in the wild exploit for something as rare as a Chrome exploit. Other panelists thought that's ridiculous, that those sorts of things are ongoing. There's always a reason to hack somebody. There's always political and military activity, so it really shouldn't change things month to month. So some panelists were more conservative on that. But one of the interesting things about this process is that they don't actually have to agree. They don't have to force each other to agree. That sort of consensus happens through an average. So they don't have to agree with each other, as you can see here. And as we resulted in this 1.5% belief that this would happen anyways. Everyone was still in this realm of once in years probability of something like this happening. So you might be wondering, how is this useful? What can we use this for? You can compare browsers with each other. So we actually did this with Firefox as well. We had another forecast organized for the same circumstances, and the browser is very similar in how it classifies a critical vulnerability. It also has 10 years of bug tracker data as well. And in this forecast, we actually came up with a expect one exploit every other year, once out of every 2 years. The difference with Firefox, though, is, as I'm sure some of us know, is that Firefox has had repeated in the wild critical exploits over the years. There's one in 2015 that had a blog post and an emergency patch. So this is very different from Chrome, which we haven't, at the time of this research, we had not actually ever seen that. So the panel's discussion was heavily in comparison with Chrome on the sandbox. So the Firefox sandbox is relatively new. There's still features being developed for it, whereas Chrome has had a polished sandbox for a decade. So that reflected itself in the panel's discussion of this and how we assigned this measurement for this risk. Now, browser examples have lots of data. They have lots of bug data. We have advisory data over a long period of time. But you don't necessarily need any data at all to issue a forecast for something. Now, other families of vulnerability don't have this type of track record. So we also measured NetSpectre as well. Speculative execution is this like highly uncertain thing that we've learned about recently, and we don't have decades of exploit data to pull from for making judgments around something like this. But it's still very scary. Like, it's a ghost with a stick. Like, this is a terrifying type of bug. So despite that, we forecasted this, and the panel's belief upon hearing about NetSpectre and getting data about how NetSpectre works, the panel's belief was that we would not see this in a short term. We would not see NetSpectre exploited in a short term, if ever. So the panel left most of its assigned belief towards not seeing it in any sort of short term. And that ended up being the case when we scored this forecast as well. This is the thing that I skipped over briefly, but forecasts are empirical because you can score them based on how events actually turned out. And a Breyer score is what's called a squared error. It's very simple to calculate, and you want it to be as low as possible. So over time, as you make predictions, you can see if you're maintaining a very low score or if you're just wildly predicting things without any rhyme or reason. So NetSpectre didn't have much data associated with it. It's a new type of vuln. But Apache struts should sort of feel very different as a discussion because we've all seen it exploited so frequently. I mean, myself personally, I've worked on incidents where struts was the root cause, and I can't say the same for NetSpectre. We also know we have Equifax in recent memory as well. So struts is a very different beast, and because it's a very different beast, we should see it measured differently. In August of last year, I believe, yeah, August of last year, there was an Apache struts vulnerability announced, and we measured it immediately. And the panel that came together to measure this predicted that we would see in the wild exploit activity the week after announcement, which is very different from what we saw with NetSpectre. The panel said, we predicted this will just not be exploited in the short term. And this is, we will see this exploited in the short term. So after this expired a week after of the announcement, you can see here the distribution of how uncertainty was assigned for each possible outcome, whether it was a week after the announcement or never. The greatest amount of belief was in the early side of this vulnerability. So what this gives us is a way to measure completely different types of bugs, completely different types of risks based on a common thing, which is whether it's going to be in the wild or not. These are different platforms, these are different stacks, these are different products altogether. But from a vulnerability standpoint, we're measuring these things based on, are we going to see this in the wild or not? And if you are the type of person that cares about that, I don't care about a bug if it's not going to be in the wild, then this measurement method might be useful for you. Even if this specific path is not useful for you, you can make a scenario say whatever you want. So long as it follows the same rules that we've gone through, you can measure whatever risk that you care about, so long as you craft the measurement method similarly. So that's the end of my presentation. This was a discussion about risk measurement. We covered the dangers of measuring risk. We discussed the tools that can be used to measure risk and the methods that can be used to measure risk. And we discussed several use cases of this method used in practice, and with a single measurement approach of whether they will be a vulnerability will be in the wild or not. And the reason that this is important to me is that I think that we need to be able to judge and test a rainmaker. I think that this is something that we need to be able to do as an industry if we want to get better. And I think the measurement gets us there. So anyhow, that's my presentation. Thanks for letting me share some of this, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. All right. Yes.
So just kind of like a two-part question. One, on the first one, the people that took the survey that answered, and you took the average from them, were they like experts in the field or just random people? Or?
People I know, but yes, I definitely had a. Let's see, I went into it thinking that they might all be public. So upon inspection, they better be experts. But I got better results by promising anonymity, because a lot of people don't want their predictions to be public, because what if they're wrong, right? And that's something that I think that we should be okay with. I think that we should be okay with accounting for predictions over time if we're going to be in a risk profession. But that is something I granted them. But yes, they were experts.
And then is this method of approach in terms of forecasting, is that similar to the Galton method of approach, where you take a survey, or kind of like a survey of like what people think of like a specific thing, and then the average tends to be the truth? Is that similar?
Galton, is this the wisdom of crowds?
Yeah, wisdom of crowds.
Yeah, the cow.
Yeah, kind of like
that is what this is.
That's what
very similar. Yeah. Okay. In fact, with that specific case, they actually looked at Galton's notes, and a mathematician reviewed his notes, and I'll explain the story. Galton is a famous mathematician that organized a bunch of people at a fair to guess a cow's weight. And of course, they were all over the map, but the average of it was a pound off of the actual weight of the cow. And this was a long time ago, whenever Galton was around. A mathematician recently went over that, his notes, and discovered that the actual, he had made an error in calculating the average, which is rare for a mathematician. But it was actually on the dot.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So there's a book called Wisdom of Crowds that discusses some of these concepts around strength in numbers as far as averaging and predicting and forecasting. Okay, we'll start from left to right.
Cost to acquire the expert panel knowledge. So many people volunteered to kind of approve it. Was there some cost to it? And if we assume the cost was rated to zero, how much would be the maximum you would have been willing to spend to acquire that expert knowledge?
Cost of measurement is one of the hardest problems that I'm running into in a lot of this. And I think that depends on the problem that you want to solve. I think that of the things that I discussed, these are all things that you can apply as layers of rigor onto a measurement if you'd like. You can have a panel of one. You can have an uncalibrated panel of one. If somebody stops you at a water cooler and says, what's the likelihood that we're going to get hacked by this struts thing? You can say 90%, do we have it? And I think that suffices for a water cooler for a quick conversation in the hallway or things like that. But if the board is asking you, what's the likelihood that we're going to be breached this year? Then I think that you should allow for a larger cost of measurement, and it's part of your decision-making process. So I don't have a rubric for that, but I think that if it's a big decision and you're willing to bring that stuff together, I think that all of the tools are there to have a very rigorous estimation brought together if you don't have data otherwise. Yeah, I promise going left to right, so we'll go back here.
Hi, Ryan. My name is Nirav Jain, and I went to school to study cybersecurity. And one of the things that they discussed at the class on how you measure risk or security vulnerabilities was you always speak in relative terms as compared to speaking in absolute numbers. What do you think is your take on that? Like, would it make more sense if I told you that product A was more secure and by the magnitude of so much by product B? Would that be more accurate, or would you think you would still stick with probabilities and numbers to give a exact measure of that?
Sure. That's a good question and a difficult one. So I think I'm spending my time working on trying to get exact numbers as best as I can, or at least in confidence intervals or credible intervals with some error associated with it, as opposed to saying that this is your likelihood of a breach. For me, it's measurement of belief. I do think that qualitative methods are very useful in risk measurement, but I think that we're overinvested on that. I think there's plenty of methods to measure risk with qualitative methods, and I don't think that there's enough accessible quantitative methods that allow for this level of quantification. I want to be able to multiply these things and add them and reduce them. To me, that's what measurement is. I don't know how much money I need to spend to make something that's orange go to yellow, right? But there's more tools associated with sort of budgeting for security and pricing out security and costing an incident with more quantifiable methods. But an ordinal method where you can simply sort things by, this is the worst, let's work on that first, I think it's useful, but that's easy too.
So the probability is expressed in like 2.63 or 0.82, and when communicating that that's useful for calculating the Breyer score, right? But when communicating it, you wouldn't use those numbers. Like that gives a sense of precision that's not really warranted.
Right.
Is that right?
I mean, there's communication problems all over this. It's a nightmare of communication problems. But I do think under the hood, if we're going to be working as engineers on these things, I think it's good to have a substantial quantification of the things that we're working on. What we say when we're done, I think is a different problem altogether.
It's very different to say once every 4 to 6 years, which people can understand, and they go, oh, it's an estimate. And you say 2.63%, then it's like, oh, wow, you guys really know it.
Yeah, it's a communication problem, and it's a huge one. I can't fully answer that. I do think, though, that engineers need to be able to work this way. But to explain to your customers or a vendor that I have a 1% chance of being breached this year, it might not fly. I would like it to fly, but I'm not sure that we're there. But I would like it to be there. So I think it's a tough problem, and I don't have an answer for it.
One more question.
Now you have to ask it.
Not me.
Okay. All right, one more.
So for things like the Apache struts vulnerability, do you think that sort of like the media coverage and like the famousness of the vulnerability plays a role in biasing towards kind of like higher probabilities? So maybe, Jenkins has as many ones than Apache does, but you're seeing like higher probabilities. Like, was that the case?
So I love the question, because that's a huge problem that I think we face right now. Like NetSpectre came out, and we were warned to fix speculative execution problems, but we have environments with struts in them, right? Some environments have a lot of trouble patching even the simple things. So I don't like that. Like a headline vulnerability can bias us that much. A headline vulnerability should be a headline vulnerability because it has a likelihood of mass exploitation, right? So a calibrated person should be more resistant to that type of bias, and a panel even more so. A panel discussing these sorts of things would be the least biased of this. But I agree. I think that this is kind of an ism, I think, but there are low-code vulnerabilities that are not worth our attention. How do we measure that? And that is what I want to be able to solve with a process like this. I want to be able to say, oh, that's a great logo. You have a cool name. You have a domain name registered. Your vulnerability sucks, and we're not going to fix it. I really do think that we should have a method for doing that that's empirical and testable. And if I end up being wrong, my error is ridiculous, and I get kicked out. We don't have that right now. So I think we need tools like that.
Correct.
Sorry, I broke the rules. One more.
Do you have a criteria on how to select a panel as such? Because they might be coming from different walks of life altogether. They might not have a complete understanding of the vendor or the product itself. So do you have any criteria in place for selecting your panel?
I do. So there's to cite research and guidance from research. You want as much diversity as possible, even if it's from folks that are or are not working on it, even if they're not familiar with the product, that could also be beneficial, so long as they're calibrated. Being calibrated with probabilistic statements can be improved from completely unfamiliar subject matter. You can predict sports and develop your prediction skill in another subject matter, which is very, very interesting. A lot of the research and prediction over time is done with people who are not actually familiar with the subject matter that they're testing. So I do think that there's a wide pool that you can pull from to build a panel. But I think you do want you want to aim for the most expertise that you possibly can, but we don't always have it, and I think that that's fine. So erring towards diversity is good, erring towards expertise is good, but I don't think that it's a disqualifier to say that this person doesn't have 10 years in the thing that they're predicting, because there are tournaments against the CIA and the intelligence community with people off the street using Google that sometimes are better than these analysts. And this is 10, 20 years of research done by Philip Tetlock. There's a book called Super Forecasting that discusses this. This guy beat the intelligence community with political forecasting with people that he brought that don't have access to confidential information. It's a very interesting subject. So that would be my guidance. Diverse panels, prefer to have more people, and prefer to have expertise, but you don't need it.
But what is the magic number that you go for when you're looking for panel? Is it like 15, 50?
More.
Oh, okay.
Well, yeah, so these all came out to be around 15, but that's about how many friends I have.
All right, thank
Okay,
you.
I'm done.
All right, next up we have Justin Berman.
Hard to follow. How am I going to follow that?
We'll find a way, I'm sure.
Now I have to make tech work. Cool. So for simplicity, I use slides because I'm a masochist, and Google Slides is the easiest way for me to hurt myself. But it does provide me this nice questions thing. I'm not going to take them till the end, but I will happily take them. And this gives you a chance to ask a question if you don't like shouting out in the auditorium. So I wanted to create a talk that maybe offends some people a little bit. That's why I titled it Maturing Beyond Application Security, because this is OWASP, which is all about application security. I'll start by kind of prefacing a little bit of my experience, not because I think it's some like laudable thing, but because I want you to understand I come from both development and application security at core. I was a consultant for 6 years at Aspect Security, and for anyone that's a really long time OWASP person, they know that Aspect kind of did the very early top 10s and whatnot. I'm happily friends with Jeff Williams and Dave. And now I'm a CISO, and I have been for about 5 years, and that gives me a much different perspective on both application security's weight in an organization, its importance, and how I think about driving value out of it. So this talk is that. It's more about why do we have to go beyond application security. So to start on the path, like I think it's not enough. Application security is a set of best practices right now. It's a need to make sure software ships with few, if any, vulnerabilities. It's compliance with policy. It's third-party pen testing. It's SAST and DAST. It's WAFs. But it's not enough. And it's not enough because it focuses the business on security as a cost avoidance mechanism. It doesn't deliver value that makes security a core part of the organization. And in the long term, I think it sets you up for cost minimization, i.e. like making the security team spend as little money as possible, and ultimately irrelevance within the organization. Now, I don't want you guys to think that I think application security is easy. I'm not saying the job is easy. I'm just saying it's not enough to do just that job. I don't think, like, I still believe that there are monumental challenges to achieving strong performance, even in a pure application security program. For those of you operating at high scale, even knowing the inventory of applications that you have within your organization can be crazy. I have friends at major banks who have thousands and thousands of applications to manage under active development, plus an innumerable count that aren't even developed anymore. There's perpetual challenges in discovering vulnerabilities and how you get coverage, and even in the applications that you're able to use to do that thing because of weird vendor relationships that your company has. Creating accountability within your organization to make sure product teams don't ship unacceptably risky things. Keeping up with a constant stream of new vulnerabilities, which maybe Ryan's point is we shouldn't, or we should think harder about what we do. And how they actually affect your systems, both forward-looking and retrospectively. All those things are hard, and I don't want you to listen to me and think he's saying this is easy and we should just move on past it. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying it's not enough. So, before I dive into like what is product security and what's different and what does it mean to do it, like let's make sure we're in sync about what it means to do AppSec well. I want to make the point that we have to have reasonably, not perfectly, but reasonably mature application security function in the organization before we start trying to take on those higher level. That's why we're maturing past it. We're not just leapfrogging over application security. So let me define a little bit of what that means to me. I hope this, oh good, this isn't an eye chart because thankfully Netflix has a massive screen for me to operate off of. So everybody here has probably seen a Maslow's hierarchy of needs in some place. And when I, as a CISO at this abstraction layer I'm operating at, think about my hierarchy of needs for my application or my product security, well, let's say my application security team, the first thing I optimize for is an inventory and basic and consistent vulnerability identification. That's that bottom layer. Like, if I don't know what products exist in my organization, if I don't know what applications are in development, if I don't understand what applications are out of development, I can't secure anything. And if I don't have a reasonable sense of how much risk that poses, or at least what vulnerabilities exist, since risk forces you to take into account probabilities, which, again, Ryan made the point that maybe we do a piss poor job of actually measuring. But if I don't understand what risk I think that, what risk space that actually occupies for the organization, it's very hard for me to actually understand where I need to focus my energy. Because if I have, if I have no coverage of a bunch of applications, that's actually the scariest thing to me, because that means that I have a lot of unknown unknowns, or maybe they're known unknowns. And what I want is to get to the largest percent of known knowns I possibly can. And for many of you, that means you're going to stand up like some kind of design review guidance. We hear tons of talk in application security about shifting left and getting into PRD, or the product and technical requirements documents of our organizations, standing up some kind of tooling for scanning. Maybe you're hand reviewing code if you're either at a very mature organization or a very immature organization. And generally, you're building up that understanding of what exists. Once we get past that, then we're really asking ourselves, like, great, can we intervene in the process of application development effectively to make sure that new things don't get in? Now that might, for some of you, mean actually, building tooling into pipelines and stuff like that. And for those of you at that maturity level, that's awesome, because that's like where we are at Zenefits, is where I was at my last company. It's a huge part of getting into that constant cadence. But for many of you, this might also be things like building training or creating policies or SLAs around fixing vulnerabilities before they hit prod, all those kinds of things. And then at the top, I talk about something that I think a lot of AppSec teams divorce themselves from, so this might be a difference of opinion between me and many of you about what an AppSec team's job is, and especially the AppSec team's job with incident response, is are vulns in your apps being exploited? There will inevitably be vulnerabilities that live in prod in your organization. You might put a WAF in front of them. You might do things to reduce the likelihood of exploitation. But like the question is, are they being exploited? How do you know? And what are you doing about it? And so that's, that is building WAF, or that's building teams with your, processes with your IR team. And that to me, like this writ large is, if I can, and I have a ton of metrics that I might measure to actually see, are these things happening or not happening within the organization? How much risk does it pose? All those kinds of questions. But if I can answer these questions in really positive ways, from my perspective, then I have satisfied my application security needs within the organization. So then let's move, like what I'm talking about, what we need to move past application security. So what's past application security for me? Product security is past application security for me. And for many of you, you might be like, tomato, tomato, same thing. Why are you differentiating? But I think it's important to recognize that product security is about a whole product in your organization and the business around it. It is not about the code artifacts or the combination of code and infrastructure artifacts that you put into place. It is about, like the CX team or your customer service teams and how they use the back end, like customer service portal that you make available to them to service your customers. It is about aligning your mission to the same mission that the whole business has and caring about the context with which you operate within. So for me, product security is about how the security team can work with the whole company and not just an application development team or a product management and an application development team, because it doesn't stop with technology or a line of code. And it, for lack of a better way of saying it, I think it extends to making you care about the full life cycle and the full use of the systems that are built or made or bought or integrated within your organization. I think it helps create a far more well-rounded security professional, but I do want to acknowledge that there are engineers, probably even in this audience, who think about that, who listen to me say this and say, like, that's not what I want to do in my career, and that's okay. Like, I'm not saying all of you individually have to do this. I'm saying you as application security, say like leaders, need to think about how you can drive more value into your organization and how you can make security more relevant. And certainly you, if I have any peer CISOs in the audience, need to think about how you can pitch and use product security to actually manifest like this whole security function with the organization, because it's going to make you more relevant to them. So what are my goals for product security? What this means for any of you here is that I'm using product security to bring security and product into full alignment with the business. I already said that. That doesn't mean we can't say no to things. That's a common question that I get, like, oh, if you're aligned with the business, I mean, you never say no. Like, do you never tell your organization no, or do you never guide them away from something? Like, that is not the case. The point is, you are there to create solutions. You are not there to throw hand grenades over walls. I have met, I'm sure none of you would do this, but I have met way too many security professionals that think that the ultimate goal in life is to find bugs, hand them to developers, and walk. That is not a product security job. That is not even really an application or a software security job. That is a pen tester's job, and that's good and useful, but it's not what we do as blue teams inside companies. So the next thing you might notice is the first two things are the same, or that's like application security goals. That's why I'm saying, like, my product security team is ultimately a maturation of an application security team. We know how to do those things. I'm not saying they're not, I'm not saying they aren't hard, but we understand how to do those things. We also understand some metrics associated with those goals already. Like we might talk about coverage, we might talk about how long vulnerabilities live in prod. We might talk about things like, we might talk about how often someone ships something outside of the accepted processes we built. But we understand metrics pretty well already associated with the kind of 1 and 2 there. But 3 and 4 are where we actually create value for the business that extends way beyond what I think a typical application security team does. So now I'm trying to make this point uber clear. Product security is a superset of application security. Unfortunately, I was lazy and did not find the superset, the actual superset ISO code, or I can't remember the code for it. But anyway, I didn't find the thing that would have actually stuck the superset icon on the screen. So I'm just saying greater than. But the idea here is, like, again, I'm trying to really square home. If you can't get the basic risk picture right from application security, like, you don't really have a lot of business going forward and trying to go build stuff for the organization, or to try and work with sales teams to try and make the point clearer to them. That's not an excuse to try and permanently put product security stuff on the back burner because you're like, oh, we don't have perfect AppSec yet. I have to do more of that first. You're never going to get there. I've probably been doing this longer than some of you and less long than others, and one constant I've found is that every organization manages to never be perfect. And if you find a perfect organization or you work for one, I will come work for you today because that seems awesome and I want to learn from you. One way you can actually make this start happening is to start converting a few of your application security, like let's say you have a team of 4 application security engineers. If you have one of them have a project each quarter to do some of the product security work, and I'm going to talk about like literal day-to-day what the product security work looks like, but if you have one of them do something each quarter, and I think about quarters because we use OKRs, and I've used OKRs for a long time, but goals, Kanban, I don't really care how you structure your work. If you have one of them doing some of this, then you'll make some progress. So don't treat this as an all or nothing 0-1 thing. Treat this as you can start somewhere. And here's some places that I like, or rather, first, here's like, again, a revisit of the Maslow's thing. So the first 3 are the exact same as the last one. The top 2 are the places where I think security starts moving into value for the business, and that's like where I try to focus and why product security matters to me. If your gates are slowing down dev, you aren't doing a good enough job. And that is a thing that I've had many people tell me is an unfair statement, because how can I possibly integrate security in the dev lifecycle fast enough? Obviously, part of why I'm saying it is to get your attention. Inherently adding process can slow things down, but your goal is to reduce that slowdown, or rather to maximize the speed of development at the same time as you introduce security, like additional security. You can't just add stuff because you want to add stuff because it makes you more comfortable. You say the risk is lower because we have all these gates that they have to pass through. Well, how can you make those gates move more smoothly? How can you make the devs move faster is a great question. And then lastly, at the top there, like, how can I actually make my business more competitive? Now, this is like harder to, I can talk about how I do it at Zenefits and what we do at Zenefits and why I think it's differential and et cetera, but this is going to vary a ton for your company. But some metrics here to think about, some stuff that I think about every day and I actually measure is like simple baseline metric. We lose 0 sales due to security concerns with our systems. That's easy, by the way. That's easy to measure. And that's a like core metric is, are we telling the story clearly, accurately, and effectively enough that no client ever, or I should say no prospect ever leaves the process because of security or privacy concerns? That's a super important thing, and that's key to me as a CISO that the product security team engages on. Second, can I win deals that I never would have won because we do security either better, or we can talk about it more effectively, or we have unique features beyond what my competitors have? Those are the kinds of things that like are at the top of my Maslow's hierarchy. Those are the kind of things where I am adding to the overall business. So everybody wants to know how it changes their day-to-day, or at least most people I talk to when I talk about this, they want to know like, okay, great, so what does that actually mean for me? What do I do? How do I do things differently? And so I want to take a step. There's 3 things for me. First, I've met way too many AppSec people that literally all they understand is code and the vulnerabilities associated in code. They don't understand what the code really, they may understand how the code interacts with each other, but they, with other code, they may understand how it moves to the back end, but they don't understand the business context. Why do we build that? Like, when you step into a product requirements document, not a technical one, but a product requirements document, like, why are we building this feature? Is a question that my product security engineers are always asking. Not because they think the product like management team is wrong about what features they're building, or they think that they are more likely to be correct, but because it allows them to avoid the trap that makes product managers hate them, which is like, oh, you have to make sure there's input validation on this. No product manager cares about that statement. You have said to them probably 1,000 times, you need to follow best practices in application development. They don't need to be reminded of that over and over again. The engineers probably don't even need to be reminded of that over and over again if the job is being done really well, but definitely product management doesn't need to be reminded of that thing over and over again. Second thought, and this is like super core, or I should say this is super top of mind for me because this has happened to me in my teams. You know where you actually create value for your product managers? You help them see around a corner they don't think about. And for me, like as an example, you know, let's say you're building a system that involves money movement and you want to verify a bank account and you use the industry standard of, you know, dropping a couple transactions, small transactions in the person's bank account and asking them to verify those amounts, and then you pull those dollar amounts or those cents amounts really back out. You can have the worst like money loss for your organization and never have made an OWASP top 10 mistake. You can get everything about basic AppSec right and still have fraud that takes advantage of business logic flaws. And who is really the best equipped to think about where a bad guy's head might be at? If you have a dedicated fraud team in your organization, sure, you can maybe trust them to do that thing. But the average product manager is building for what they expect at least good intent user to do. You, in your world of being like, at least I come from a place where originally I was just like, how can I mess with this? You know, all the way back to how can I mess with config files and games? How can I, maybe I shouldn't admit this on stage, but like how can I find the right wares? How can I do that? Like long, long ago for me at this point. But how can I hex edit things? How can I break stuff? You can come at this from a mindset that they don't, and that adds value not just to them but to the whole company because you just stopped a fraud event from happening. You know, we Zenefits have experienced all kinds of things that are prevented because my product security engineers are actively engaged in that product process, and they're like, hey, but what if someone, you know, changed the bank account number that they were trying to verify mid-verification process? And many of you probably are like, well, duh, I would do that. Like, why wouldn't you try that? Why wouldn't you protect against that? But a product manager isn't incentivized to think about that. They're thinking like, how can I make a product that is beautiful and effective, works right? And so as you move out of that application security mindset and you move into a product security mindset and you think about the context, which we already talked about, of the business that you're operating in, you can add crazy amounts of value, and the product managers are going to look at you and be like, that's amazing. They may on the other hand look at you and say like, that's not part of my MVP, but they will definitely value the input in a way that they're not ever going to value you telling them that they have to make sure there's no XSS flaws on their homepage. And then last thought here, product security may or may not, they do, for me, own a bunch of other problem sets. I have privacy reporting to me, so they own interactions about privacy and advising the organization about privacy. They may or may not own that for you, but what they can do is make sure that, you know, legal, compliance, privacy, your fellow teams that are all striving to minimize risk at the organization all know about the products. You are, especially if you built the good relationships that one expects a product security team to build with your engineering peers and your product peers, a clearinghouse for all the things that are built in the organization. And so whether it is your job to understand privacy law like California CPA or GDPR, since that's hot button for everyone that has an international business, whether that's your job or not, like there is someone at the organization whose job it is. might be their 5th job or their 3rd job or their 1st job, but there's someone whose job it is, and you, the product security engineer, can add value to the whole business by making sure that person who normally might be left out of conversations, either hopefully because people don't know them or they're overloaded, is aware of the things that are being built in the organization. Now, I have worked at a number of highly regulated organizations, which means that I have a perspective that's born out of, like, I need to involve my legal team in more things, or I need to involve my compliance team in more things, or I need to make sure that we cover the privacy requirements. But I will tell you that in every organization I've ever seen, there is a wide array of problems that sit outside your team that other teams would love if you would help them clear. And that you can, not manually, I'm not saying go like, it's your job, you know, to individually go to the privacy team every time a thing comes up, but, you know, like tag them in the Google Doc if there's a PRD, like we set up a PRD template in Confluence so that it automatically tagged in privacy people based on questions that got asked and answered during the creation of the template itself. Maybe that's beyond your team, or not to say beyond them technically. I'm sure most of you are more than technical enough to do that, but it is a way of automating a process so that you're not thinking about this as purely, I'm telling you to go do more work every single time a new project happens. So the last thing I want to talk about, and then I'll take questions, is that the other main area I spend my time on with my product security team is really moving past this idea that we are not just here to find and point out problems and then provide some guidance about those problems. The way I think about it is simple. My team can level up by providing solutions and not problems. And I think like there's 2 main ways we do this, and it may take new skills on your team. It may take development experience on your product security team, which you might not have right now because you might only have analysts or whatever else. But these 2 things have basically gotten me, I would say, more overall budget from organizations than almost anything else. And that's first, I build and own key security capabilities for the organization. This has tons of dividends. Like in my case, I build and own Auth. I build and own Auth-Z as well for our front-facing products. And those 2 things are very direct security controls, and they give me, like, if you want to think about back to the AppSec world, I can lint for the use of those things. And if you want to think about the product security world, my teams understand business context, so they can actually ask questions about whether the role assignments are correct, the configuration of Auth-Z is right, not just the question, have we used the Auth-Z framework we're supposed to be using in this place. Second, like, it gives your teams empathy for the rest of the engineering organization. It may take some of your teams and turn them into security product managers, because it is super useful to have a product management mindset when you go into these conversations with the product managers and having to own a service for the organization and respond to the needs of, like, when people need a change of the service or they need to use it a different way or you need to modify it or whatever else, all super valuable to making your, say, like, AppSec lead into more of a product-minded person. Second, and just as important to me, and really like core to that kind of top of that Maslow's hierarchy is this kind of crux, which is I want the company to sell more product, right? Or I want them to be more successful. I want them to sell more services. I want to make more money. And if you in security are still of the mindset that my job is to keep things safe and that's all my job is, then you're missing the fact that security is ultimately part of the business. You exist to help the business succeed. And so for me, how do I make product security part of helping the business succeed is the thing. How do I get here? This is org specific and product specific. At Zenefits, we build, I mean, the straightforward thing that I'd say applies to lots of organizations that we build is ATO detection, so account takeover detection, right? Like if you build a web app and you don't think that people are trying to take over accounts, then either your web app is super new or you're not looking at your logs. Because I have literal, like I'm friends with security leaders at basically, I'd say like a solid 90 different organizations now, and there's not one of them that isn't dealing, at least if they have web apps, with ATO all over, like all the time. And you know what creates a really valuable conversation with a customer? Hey, we saw your account got taken over. They tried to do these things. We detected it. We stopped it. Here's your account back. That doesn't mean that a security person has to do that, by the way. We build processes inside Zenefits, and I would always recommend that you build processes that allow your customer success or support teams to do that for you. I'm not saying you have to have all those conversations, but we have that conversation. That is immediately like a thing that the sales team can sell. That is a thing that existing customers look at us and they're like, oh my God, no one's ever reached out to me personally to help me recover an account. You saved me X amount of dollars because I didn't have to pay to go through a fraudulent pay run. I didn't have to go through fraudulent benefits enrollments. And those latter two things are context for Zenefits, but you have that kind of context you can get out of your organization too. And so for me, the crux is how do I build things? How do I either prototype or build and fully own technology, or it doesn't even have to be tech, could be processes, could be detections, could be data science, whatever. How do I build things that allow my company to make more money and often, and with a security lens? So how do I allow how do I allow my company to differentiate itself with security? Because the day that, I can give sales tools that are beyond just, hey, we have a SOC 2, hey, we have, like all these pen tests that we do every year, and they can sell on that thing. And if you really want to dig into it, then you help them sell on that thing. So with that, I will, those are the 3 points that, to me, these are the 3 points that I would say you have to do to mature beyond to mature beyond application security. And we're hiring. And if you want to come solve these kinds of challenges, I will happily talk with you about how you can come solve real business challenges with security at Zenefits. So with that, I'll look at my questions. So the first one I got, and after I bang through these, I'm happy to take more if we have time. When talking about application security, what do you define as the application? What are the boundaries of that definition? For me, when I think about application security, I think about the combination of technologies. So that's everything from, at Zenefits, we blend our cloud security teams and our application and product security teams. So I guess I think about an application as being every piece of technology that isn't core infrastructure, i.e. repeatable, building blocks that get dropped. So if a particular application needs specific infrastructure, that's part of that application. If we use just one more database that is the exact same as 30 other databases, it's not part of what I call application security. And then certainly all the custom code, libraries, other products that got integrated into that application sit within that boundary. I don't think that it's useful to draw an arbitrary boundary around just the custom code you write, because ultimately that code interacts with a wide array of other things. Answered that question. For the hierarchy slide, can't help but wonder about the time dimension of having to accept vulnerabilities because of pressure to release features. Am I off completely in my thinking? You will always face, maybe I even addressed this question afterwards, but there is always going to, this is why I say there will always be vulnerabilities in prod in your organization, not because you're doing a bad job, not because your organization wants to do a bad job, but because if you can measure risk, you can help have a better conversation about this. But ultimately, there's hey, if I don't ship this today, we will lose a $10 million deal, versus you saying, hey, there's a SQL injection on the homepage, and the engineering team going, well, we'll fix it in a week. And you go well, am I going to block a $10 million deal because of a week of extant vulnerability? That's a risk measurement and modeling question. Is that vulnerability in 1 week worth $10 million is a really interesting question to answer, But I don't think anyone here would be wrong to say that there is always going to be some level of vulnerabilities existing in the wild. Shouldn't use in the wild after the last talk. Existing live in production on your site. Does your application security program currently consider any areas related to the development or use of AI systems? If not, why not? If so, please describe your approach to assess and manage related risk. So I think there is a really interesting question in here. I'll answer broadly first and then specifically. We would always consider AI systems because it is technology that we are building and putting into production. The reason that I think AI or ML or any of the other buzzwords around that are interesting is because they're non-deterministic systems, and I guess simulating and assessing for even the basic AppSec vulnerabilities is non-trivial in a non-deterministic system because you can't always predict how it's going to respond to a specific set of inputs. And so I end up doing, or rather I think about it in terms of probabilistic modeling of input to output, and can we, like try, yes, you can fuzz the thing and whatnot if you have that A capability, B time, and C inclination. But ultimately I think about, can I predict, or can I model lots of different kinds of inputs that we think might represent some kind of vulnerability, because you can't actually go down every decision path that an AI system does, because inherently often they are non-descriptive. I don't know if that really answered the question. Okay. And then I have, when coming into an organization new to security, say they're being taken down a path to set up a scanner on the web app, how can I get them to move away from that and more into AppSec as a security engineer? So, well, I do want to take a step back and say, like, I don't know that I think setting up a scanner is inherently bad. If that is the totality of a strategy, that is terrible. But if that is a part of a vulnerability discovery strategy or even an inventorying strategy, scanning is an important part of that thing. We use scanners both in a, how do we make sure we know all the endpoints that are on the internet that we put out there, because we want to second check verify, or rather, belt and suspenders verify, that our understanding of what we put on the internet as described by our ELBs, our ALBs, et cetera, is correct. But in addition to that, I think as you target specific vulnerabilities, like if you say, I hypothesize that I don't want to be hit by any scanner that is publicly used by adversary groups, right? Like SQL map is used by some set of adversary groups. I don't want to ever be vulnerable to SQL map. And so for me, pointing that kind of scanner back at myself constantly allows me to increase my confidence that I'm not going to be affected by that particular scanner, and thus I cut off a whole tool chain, or at least I try to cut off a whole tool chain for an adversary. So I think your question comes from, like, how do you convince someone to move away from a pure scanner methodology into like a, how do we actually have a program? The answer for me is usually that I don't join organizations that are so focused on just scanning a thing. I join organizations that are focused on delivering like an actual security as value. If I was in an organization or trying to convince an organization to move from one to the other, I would start with talking about the costs and the benefits and how you're going to accelerate their overall delivery, because the highest expense to fixing a vulnerability is when it's in prod. Like if you can fix a vuln earlier because you have a good AppSec program and it finds it at the technical design, or it finds it while code is being written but before it's shipped, it's a lot cheaper. And so I'd probably start down that line with the CTO organization or the CIO organization, depending on your company. And if I was in a position where I was trying to convince a CFO, I could use a similar line. It's less expensive. If I'm in a position where I'm trying to convince a CEO, then I'm going to talk about how holistically this will benefit us and how we can think about how this will make a difference to his ability to make more money. Cool. That's all the questions I have from the thing. If there's any other questions you guys have, I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, I will happily load a network. Cool. Thank you.
Okay, we have some desserts, and all of the bags with the Netflix logo have to go, so please take them on your way out. Thank you so much for coming. Hang out for a bit. We've got the place till 9. Thank you.